Welcome everyone to the Get Housing Right Conference presented by the University of Rhode Island Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies with support from Homes, Rhode Island. My name is Roya Izadi. Currently, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the government department at Cornell University, but I'm an incoming assistant professor of political science at University of Rhode Island starting in the fall. I'll be moderating our panel today. Our today's panel is called Zoning for Housing Access. We will discuss a proposal for states to create their own zoning atlas. We will discuss impacts of broad legalization of 2 to 4 unit buildings in select US states. And we'll examine the current state of the MBTA Communities law in Massachusetts, which requires by right multifamily zoning in 175 communities. So before I introduce our wonderful panelists, I would like to mention a few points of order. So our panels will present for approximately 15 minutes each, and then we'll proceed with question and answer after all presentations are concluded. And then we'll have about 25 minutes for our question and answer session. So we'll have plenty of time for conversation with our guests. I also encourage everyone in the audience to enter your questions and thoughts into the chat. You can do it while our panelists are presenting or wait until the question and answer session starts. With that, I'm happy to introduce our first panelist, Jesse Kanson Benanav from Abundant Housing Mass. He will be talking about current state of the MBTA Communities law in Massachusetts. Jesse, if you take a moment to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, what you do before your presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you for that introduction. My name is Jesse Kanson Benanav, and I'm, as was said, I'm Executive Director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. We're a statewide pro-housing advocacy organization here in the Bay State, and our focus is on, our motto is Massachusetts is for everyone. We believe every community in the state should be open and welcoming to everyone, and that for generations, our housing, our zoning policies have limited access to many communities across the state. That's helped drive our housing affordability crisis, which here in Eastern Massachusetts is one of the worst in the country. And it's also led to and perpetuated segregation within communities and throughout our region. And so those are the challenges that we're trying to face, trying to address. I am going to talk about the MBTA Communities law in Massachusetts, which is a new law enacted a couple years ago. I'm going to pull up my slide deck here. Give me just 1 second. All right. I hope folks can see the slide here. Great, wonderful. So, as I said, the MBTA Communities law was passed in January of 2021. It was part of a larger economic development bill that the legislature passed in the 11th hour after the 2019-2020 legislative session was extended for a number of months in light of the pandemic. The MBTA Communities law that I'm going to talk about was part of a larger package that had been advocated for a number of legislative sessions that was called Housing Choice. That's sort of the marketing slogan that was given to it. And there were 3 sort of primary elements of that, of which the MBTA Communities piece was one of it. The 2 other elements, just very briefly, Massachusetts was one of the few states that required a supermajority vote of your planning board or city council or town meeting to enact certain zoning changes or any zoning changes, special permits, variances. And what the Housing Choice Law did was reduce that to the more, small d democratic, simple majority to enact certain pro-housing zoning changes. So building housing near transit, accessory dwelling units, and a few other instances, allowing it to be passed by simple majority vote. And then also it created the opportunity for judges to apply a $50,000 bond whenever an abutter appeals a zoning decision or special permit or variance for a new development. But I'm going to focus today on number 2, which has gotten a lot of national attention, which is the MBTA Communities Bill. MBTA Communities law, as adopted in 2021 and signed by the governor, requires at least one zoning district of reasonable size that allows multifamily housing by right within a half mile of transit. One other really important piece of this is that the housing has to be suitable for families with children, really encouraging larger bedroom sizes in those developments. And in particular, you can't place age restrictions on developments within these zones. Building multifamily housing for elders is certainly an important need in our state, but often building housing for seniors has been a way to get out of building affordable housing and multifamily housing for families. So that's the letter of the law. This law applies to 100, it's actually, I have a typo here, it's 175 communities that are defined within Massachusetts general law as quote unquote MBTA communities. And you can see all of those communities on this map. It includes almost all of Eastern Massachusetts and gets all the way out to Worcester. So it hits a little bit of Central Mass as well. One thing to note that Boston is not included in this law. It's really focused on getting the 175 other communities around Boston and north, south, and west to do their part in building the homes that we need for the region. In the law, if communities don't adopt multifamily housing in compliance, they become ineligible for certain state infrastructure funds. MassWorks in particular, which is the largest infrastructure grant that the state has to communities. If you don't comply with this law and adopt multifamily zoning near transit, you become ineligible for that pot of money. Another thing that was left a little bit unclear in the law was the definition of reasonable size. The law says that these districts have to be quote unquote reasonable size, but there wasn't any definition of reasonable size in the law. So it was left to the Massachusetts Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development and their sub-agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, to define reasonable size and other elements of how this law will be implemented in guidelines that were drafted late last year. So as I just said a second ago, in December of 2021, the Department of Housing and Community Development in Massachusetts released guidelines for how communities will implement this law and defining things like that reasonable size question. Those guidelines stated that reasonable size included at least 50 acres around transit with a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre. So that actually means 50 acres is a sizable district within near transit. And the 15 units per acre actually means that you can achieve that with a range of density types. You can do triple deckers, townhomes, smaller apartments, as well as larger multifamily buildings, as long as you achieve that minimum gross density of 15 units per acre over 50 acres. And it has to accommodate a minimum number of multifamily units, or what the guidelines call zoned capacity, based on the transit service in your community. So you can see this chart. This is what DHCD defined. Highest level of transit service in Massachusetts is those communities that have rapid transit, meaning subway or light rail. followed by communities that have MBTA bus service. Buses run more frequently than commuter rail. Buses followed by commuter rail, and then adjacent communities. So even if you don't actually have an MBTA station or a bus line that runs through your community, but you are next to a community that does, you are impacted by this law. What each of these communities are required to do now is multiply the number of existing units in their community by this minimum multifamily percentage. So in the case of a community like Brookline or Cambridge, both of which have rapid transit service, they have to take their existing housing stock and multiply it by 25% to understand the number of new units that they must zone for near transit in their community. Just to sort of further define that, you can see on this map which communities are the rapid transit communities, which are bus, which are commuter rail, and which are those adjacent communities. To further illustrate that question or that point about the multiplier and how you define how many units your community must zone for under this law, I've included a few examples. So Somerville being a community that has subway service, they have 36,000 current units. And if you multiply that capacity, zoned capacity target, 25% being a subway community, Somerville is now required to zone for at least 9,067 new homes near transit in their community. And you can see as it gets down to bus, commuter rail, and MBTA adjacent communities. In the example of Ashby here, this is a town that doesn't have its own MBTA service. It also has, but it's adjacent to a town that does. It has a very small number of existing housing units. And so if you multiply them by 10, you would get, a small fraction of that. What DHCD has said is in these MBTA adjacent communities where multiplying by 10% would result in very, very few new units, they have to zone for a minimum capacity of 750 units. So I know a lot of this is complex, and I'm happy to answer questions in the question and answer period, but I'm going to just continue on here. So what's next for this law? Just want to talk about some of the positive elements of this. Apart from the sort of philosophical benefits in that we have a housing crisis in Massachusetts, and to a large degree, that housing crisis is driven by the fact that we've severely underbuilt homes for a generation. In fact, in the 30 years prior to 1990, Massachusetts built about 900,000 new homes. In the 30 years or so since 1990, we've built almost half that number of homes. And that's at a time where our population has grown, our economy has expanded, and we've added a lot of new jobs and new demand for housing. And so that's helped the insufficient supply of homes around the eastern and central Massachusetts region is part of what's driven our housing crisis. So the fact that we have this law and we have these very clear, ambitious targets for these 175 communities is a great, great benefit. Also, what's positive is that this law and the guidelines require the zoning to allow these types of buildings to be built by right. Any multifamily zoning adopted under this law has to allow as of right development. So you don't need special variances or permits to get it done. That will help expedite, once these zones are in place, expedite the creation of new homes under this law to help us reach the target in excess of 400,000 or so new homes that we need around the region in order to meet the demand for housing in Eastern Massachusetts. And they also, these guidelines set a very clear framework for communities to begin planning around. I think what I skipped over earlier, and just to be clear, the guidelines that govern this program are currently in draft form. It was released in December of 2021. The state agencies accepted public comment on these guidelines until March 31st. And we're sort of in a waiting game right now until they finalize the guidelines, which will be either later this spring or summer, but hopefully in time for communities to begin complying later this year or early next. And then finally, another positive aspect is that Massachusetts has other strong pro-housing laws, 40B, which is our state affordable housing law, and 40R, which is our state smart growth law. I'm not going to get into those in this presentation, but this law can work on top of or in tandem with those existing laws that have helped produce affordable and smart growth zoning around our state. Some of the challenges that we're facing is the consequences for communities that don't comply with this law is very minimal on the surface. Ineligibility for the MassWorks grant program and a couple other programs. Most of the 175 communities under this law haven't even utilized those laws in the past, and even some that have made a calculation recently that they think they can afford to withgo those grant funds in the future by simply choosing not to comply with this law. So we need to think about what are the other consequences, either through legislative changes or other actions at the state level to make communities comply. Another challenge, this is a mandate for zoning, but zoning does not guarantee that the homes will be produced under this law. Obviously, putting land together, developers finding it, financially feasible for them to build in 175 communities, that's going to take a long time. So it's simply having this law, and even if all 175 communities comply, it's not a guarantee that we'll actually have development of new homes that we severely need. Another challenge is that the law doesn't have any consideration specifically for affordable housing. Some communities do have inclusionary zoning laws that can be layered on top, but that's been a point of contention about the law and the guidelines. And so we need to think about how to make sure that housing that is built under this program is affordable to everyone. And then finally, this is a transit-oriented program. This housing has to be near transit, but we need to make sure that it's actually oriented towards that transit, that you can easily access that transit, and that the transit actually serves your need, which is an ongoing question in Massachusetts. As I said, we're in this implementation stage. DHCD did collect comments from the public at large over the last few months. And what we found, this was a recent Globe article, was that a lot of communities, particularly some of the most exclusionary communities with the highest cost of housing, are pushing back against this law. And as I alluded to a couple of times already, are beginning to make calculations around whether they actually feel like they need to or want to comply with this law. Sort of in summary, one of the things not in summary, but the last point I want to make is questions around sort of what is our pro-housing activists doing to help encourage local compliance with this law. At this point, as I said, we're sort of in a waiting game to see what the final guidelines from the state will be. But really what we need to do is make sure we drive the narrative that local pro-housing advocates in the 175 communities around the region who support this law, who want to see their communities comply and comply with strong zoning under this law, need to begin to seed conversations at the local level. We, as Abundant Housing, are working with our advocates around the region, our members around the region, to begin placing letters to the editors in local community newspapers and online community forums to support the law and support local compliance, and to do things like begin shifting the narrative and making sure folks understand this isn't just a wonky law, but there's a moral imperative why we need to build more housing in Massachusetts. I'm happy to answer more questions. I think I'm over my time. I've put a couple links up here for folks. I think the slides will be shared, so feel free to check it out. And if you want to be in touch with us at Abundant Housing, here's how you can be in touch.